Hey, this is Dave Mansue for Bass University TV. I want to talk to you today about the jig. The jig is probably the most versatile bait we have in our arsenal, and if I was going to put one bait in my boat, only one, it would be a jig. Why? Because you can work it from top to bottom of the water column. It's really that versatile. A lot of things you have to remember about a jig is it catches big fish. You know, there's probably been more money won on a jig than any other bait that we use. But there's so many different applications and styles that, you know, to some people it can be confusing. Many of you may know that I won a Bassmaster Open on the Upper Chesapeake, and I did it with a jig. In that particular tournament, I used a football jig. Happened to be a green pumpkin. Actually, it was a peanut butter and jelly football jig with a green pumpkin trailer. The reason I used it is because I was fishing rocks. And the football head has such a design that it won't dig into the rocks. You're more likely to be able to use this jig over top of the rocks and around the rocks without getting hung up than any other style. In that particular tournament, I was fishing a lot of heavy current rather, and it was important for me to use a 3/4 ounce jig. What I found was the current was running over the rocks and the fish were tucked in very tight to the rocks on the back side of the current. If I used anything lighter than a 3/4 ounce jig, the jig would actually come over the rocks and go well beyond it before it got down to the depth where the fish were. Well, they weren't back here off the rocks, they were right tight against it. So what I was doing was pulling the jig over the rocks and allowing it to fall directly down to the fish. The weight, adjusting the weight was extremely important in winning that tournament and getting the quality bites that I did. That and the fact that the football jig, again, doesn't hang up as much. A regular pointed head or a grass head on a jig would get stuck in the rocks and I would have had a lot of problems with it. Not to say I didn't lose jigs, but this was the proper application for that particular tournament. Knowing what weight to use is extremely important no matter what cover you use. If you're throwing into lay down logs or stumps, you know, you don't want that thing plopping in so hard that it digs down into the roots and it gets hung up. If you're fishing grass, you know, the fish are either on top of the grass or under the grass. So do I use a weight that lays on top, a weighted jig that lays on top of the grass and I can ease it over it, or do I want a jig that goes down through it? Many times what we find is when they're on top of the grass, we want a much lighter jig, something that I can get through the top of the grass without it getting hung up. I want to ease it over those little tufts of grass, around the points in the grass, and allow the fish to see the bait. In the summertime, when the fish actually get underneath the grass and maybe get down deeper in it, I'm going to use a much heavier jig, all right? This happens to be a 1 ounce jig. It's got a big trailer on it. I want a big bait to mimic the bait that they're feeding on then, which is typically brim or sunfish. And this bait will do that for me. It's heavy enough that it will go down through the grass and go to the bottom and allow the fish to see it. It also, one of the most important factors in any jig is to have a hook that's big enough to pull a fish out of cover. I like a jig with a heavy wire hook, all right? Very strong hook and a very sharp hook, because I want to be able to get that bait into the fish and I want to be able to pull them out. I don't want the hook flexing. I don't want the hook opening up where the fish now has a better opportunity to get off of it. Also, you want a light weed guard. You don't want a weed guard that's so stiff that it won't collapse when the fish bites it. All right, very important. I always like to take my jigs and I like to spread the weed guard so that it will
Welcome to Bass University TV, an online video training course where you'll learn champion bass fishing techniques from pro anglers Pete Glusek, Mike Iaconelli, and their talented special guests. From on the water to in the classroom, you'll learn sound techniques and strong fundamental bass fishing skills. Watch hours of video content on multiple topics at your own pace for a low monthly fee. Cancel at any time. Information is power in the sport of fishing, so learn from the very best. Subscribe to Bass University TV today.